This occurred when I was about 12 years old, a period where I possessed sufficient awareness of my environment and a reasonable grasp of peril, yet still found myself at an age that unfortunately drew the attention of certain undesirable individuals. We resided in a reasonably active neighborhood, albeit on a cul-de-sac bordering a wooded expanse. Directly opposite our residence was a drainage area. If one were to traverse the wooded zone, they would emerge into a modest community park. One particular Saturday evening, a small festival was being held in the park. As I had no prior engagements with acquaintances, my maternal figure proposed I investigate the festivities. She was not the type of parent who restricted her offspring from venturing out after sunset. She consistently granted me autonomy. Consequently, I decided to attend. I traversed the woods with illumination and eventually crossed the barrier leading into the park, where I beheld illuminated amusement rides everywhere. A large wheel, a compact coaster, some rapid spinning contraptions, and naturally, refreshment booths and skill game stalls. It was late enough that the attendance was sparse. There was also a sizable marquee tent adorned with alternating bands of vermilion and ivory, where I observed several individuals entering. I peered inside, discerning 4 rows of spectators, and upon a small platform, 3 jesters were performing feats. One was navigating a small wheeled contraption, another was manipulating objects in the air, and the third was simply moving rhythmically. The dancing one noticed my head protruding into the tent and skipped closer to me, beckoning with indigit, signaling for me to approach or perhaps join them on the platform. I wasn't certain what he intended. All I knew was that I desired neither outcome. Thus I retreated. I encountered a comrade near one of the skill games and spent approximately 30 minutes in his company. Before long, the festival was winding down, and people began to disperse. I bid farewell to my comrade and oriented myself back towards the woods. I was nearing the barrier when I perceived a sound emanating from behind me. It was one of the jesters, the one who had gestured to me earlier. He inquired if I wished to explore the area behind the performance tent and observe some intriguing sights typically unseen by guests. I swiftly declined and entered the wooded area, casting glances back every few moments to confirm I wasn't being trailed. I wasn't. The jester merely stood there observing me, the artificial grin painted on his visage rendering the scenario even more unsettling. Once I was out of his sight, I commenced running for a short distance before I felt confident he wouldn't be able to locate me. I had no intention of informing my maternal figure of the incident, as I valued the freedom to depart whenever I wished and feared this might jeopardize that privilege. The trek through the woods is roughly a half-mile. I was probably about 3/4 of the distance back when I again heard it. This time a wave of nausea immediately washed over me upon hearing the sound. I spun around and saw the same jester emerging from the gloom of the woods into the luminescence of my torch. When he drew near enough, I hurled the torch at him and bolted towards my dwelling. I heard him pursuing closely behind me until the road became visible. Then I heard him desist. Upon reaching home, my breathing was labored as if I had completed a demanding race, and my maternal figure was understandably concerned. I still wished to withhold the truth, so I fabricated a story claiming I had run the entire distance back. Following that night, the subject never arose again until the age of approximately 14. I always harbored an apprehension towards jesters, dating back to my first encounter with one at the age of 5 during a local fair on a chilly autumnal evening. During a school break, my parents were away on holiday and my sibling and brother were out for the evening. My acquaintance, whom I shall refer to as Alex, expressed a desire to visit so we could stroll to the nearby fair situated a few blocks away. He arrived and we proceeded to the fair, which occupied a spacious, unoccupied parking area. We wandered around for a while and participated in a few of the fair games. Then we happened upon a jester. He remained silent, simply smiling, bobbing around, and making comical hand gestures. He more closely resembled a pantomime artist than a traditional jester and appeared to subtly decrease the distance between us every few seconds. Alex and I exchanged amused glances. Alex lightly tapped him on the shoulder and we moved on. "That felt odd," I remarked to Alex. "That was more disquieting than odd," Alex replied. We were now proceeding back towards my residence, traversing the walkways of the tranquil autumnal neighborhood streets, when we detected a sound from behind us. It was the cadence of footfalls. We turned but perceived no one. This continued for several more minutes. Alex voiced his unease and declared his intention to return to his own dwelling, but I persuaded him to remain with me and spend time at my place, largely because I was now experiencing apprehension myself. We were certain we were being followed. We arrived at the entrance of my house. I fumbled in my pocket, retrieved my ring of keys, and began searching for the correct one among the 3 in the dim light. At that moment, Alex nudged me to pivot. There was a jester concealed within the foliage of the adjacent dwelling, and he was observing us intently. Upon noticing that we had detected him, he emerged from the foliage and began advancing towards us. I began to panic, attempting each of the 3 keys until the portal finally yielded. We entered and quickly secured the entrance behind us. I immediately contacted my parents, who instructed us to procure something for defense and seek refuge upstairs. We ascended to my younger brother's chamber and peered out the pane. The jester was positioned in our path, gazing upwards at the pane where we stood as if in anticipation. I drew the covering and we both lowered ourselves, breathing heavily and in a state of agitation. Within 10 minutes he was gone. I presume he relinquished his pursuit, or at least that is our assumption. For all we knew, he could have remained hidden somewhere on the property for the entire night. I am merely relieved we reached home in time. If you have perused recent news reports, there have been numerous accounts of jesters attempting to entice young individuals into wooded areas. I was among the initial few to undergo this experience, and it was profoundly terrifying. I wish to preserve my anonymity presently, merely as a precaution should the jester ascertain my identity. In any case, here is what transpired. I am 14 years of age and reside in a small community in a southern state. The community has a populace of around 130 souls. The summer period was drawing to a close, and I had secured a seasonal occupation at the local timber supply establishment. It was a commendable place to earn. I assisted patrons in loading timber onto their conveyances, a fairly straightforward task, and it allowed me to maintain physical fitness. The most favorable aspect was that my dwelling was precisely 1 mile distant, rendering walking to and from work a routine occurrence. I had spent a protracted day transporting and manipulating timber, and my shift was nearly concluded. It was approximately 9:30 p.m. when I commenced my journey homeward. The celestial body was just beginning to illuminate the route, and the solar sphere had completely descended beyond the elevated terrain. There are no other residential structures between the timber supply and my abode. Our community is exceedingly rural. The path home features elevations that peak sufficiently high that visibility of what lies on the other side is obscured until one reaches the crest. The route is narrow with no bordering strip, but it had recently been resurfaced. The arboreal growth stands densely one behind the other in formation, and the vegetation is thick with a few pathways carved by wild creatures emerging onto the route. The sounds of nocturnal insects and amphibians create a symphony. The walk homeward typically occupies about 30 minutes. I have undertaken it so frequently that I amuse myself with auditory content. I inserted my listening devices, selected some melodies, and proceeded. I was roughly halfway home when I detected what sounded like a high-pitched, shrill outburst of amusement. "What in the blazes was that?" I vocalized to myself. I removed my listening devices and halted. I initially considered it might be part of the music, but something about it seemed out of place within the composition. I remained motionless, listening intently for a repetition of the sound. However, the amphibian calls were so deafening that even a cry might not have been audible. I dismissed the incident and continued my journey home. The subsequent day, I commenced my shift at 2 p.m. I began my walk to work around 1:30. Nothing seemed unusual. It was a pleasant day. I typically direct my gaze downward at my feet and dislodge any stones I encounter. Witnessing them rebound across the recently paved surface was unexpectedly gratifying. I propelled a stone, and it skipped across the paving before coming to rest near something peculiar lying in the earth at the edge of the route. It appeared to be a vividly scarlet orb. I retrieved it. I applied slight pressure, and it emitted a sound. Immediately, I recognized its nature. "This is a jester's nasal accessory," I articulated to myself. "What is this object doing out here?" I retained it and carried it to my workplace to exhibit it to the other personnel. I even affixed it to my face and caused it to emit sounds. It elicited a few smiles. The day progressed as usual, and around 9:30 p.m. I concluded my duties and commenced my extended walk homeward. I had neglected to bring my listening devices from home, thus precluding my usual auditory accompaniment. While en route home, I managed to discern a faint outline of a form about 150 paces ahead, resembling a large grazing animal standing in the center of the route. It was difficult to perceive clearly as a low-lying vapor hovered over the terrain, and the celestial light silhouetted the creature. As I approached within about 100 paces, it must have been startled. I observed a rough shape scurry back into the wooded area. Little did I apprehend this was not a large grazing animal, but something far more malicious. I passed the location where the perceived creature had retreated back into the woods. As I walked past, I heard footfalls approximately 20 paces behind me. I found this peculiar, as I had never before observed a large grazing animal return to the route once it had been frightened away. Before I could turn back, I heard, "Greetings." I rotated my head to behold a jester positioned in the middle of the route, his extremities clasped behind his back. He was attired in loose legwear and an oversized upper garment clearly intended as jester attire. But it was exceptionally soiled, so much so that the original hues had faded into discolorations. His facial paint was smeared and his ocular areas were darkened. He inclined his cranial structure to the side and uttered, "You possess an item belonging to me. I require its return." He emitted a brief, quiet chuckle after speaking. I do not possess anything of yours," I stammered as I began to retreat. My dwelling was still approximately a quarter-mile distant. This was when the situation transitioned from merely peculiar to utterly terrifying. He declared, "Well then, if you do not have my nasal accessory, I shall require yours." He produced something from behind his back, and I will not embellish. It appeared to be a large, heavy blade. I turned, and with every ounce of my strength I commenced running down the center of the route. I could hear his unclothed feet pounding the ground. I did not glance back, as it might impede my speed. The edge of what I presumed were two large blades scraped against the paved surface. I was in excellent physical condition, but I could still perceive his footfalls growing louder, indicating he was gaining ground on me. He would even let out a small, high-pitched sound of amusement that further fueled my adrenaline. My respiratory organs began to ache. I started to ascend the incline. At this instant, I could hear him almost directly behind me, nearly within reach, and then, unexpectedly, a motor vehicle crested the incline, its illumination flooding the path ahead of me. I wildly gestured with my limbs in sheer panic. It halted. I quickly glanced behind me to see nothing. No jester. I recounted the events to the individual in the motor vehicle, and he contacted the authorities. I will never undertake that walk again. I have no conception how the jester reached that location and why he lay in wait for me. I have never observed any vehicles parked there, nor are there any other residential structures besides mine for miles around. This manifested my most dreadful imagining. Now I have discovered that this phenomenon is occurring to a greater number of individuals, jesters concealing themselves in wooded regions and pursuing people. Is this a collective? A fraternity of unsettling jesters with a shared objective of instilling terror in others? I possess no answers, but I do know that I will never again be able to navigate in the absence of light or perceive jesters in the same manner.